video, we're going to be going over how regular plurals in English work as a case study for how morphology and phonology can overlap. So we know that there are three forms of the English regular plural. So you take a noun like cat and pluralize it, and we know that we add a s to the end of it to get cats. We take a noun like dog and we add z to it, dogs. And if we've got a noun like fish, then we add an uz to it, fishes. Okay, now, so that means that we've got these three forms of the English plural. And in linguistics, we always want to ask the question, well, how do speakers know which form to use? So whenever we find more than one form, we have to ask that question. So we're going to posit hypotheses to answer that question. Hypothesis number one is that speakers simply memorize the plural form for each noun. So, for example, part of knowing the noun cat is knowing that its plural is cats, and the plural for dog is dogs, and the plural for fish is fishes. That's sort of similar, and we know that that has to be the case, at least for some nouns. So for the noun child becoming children, there's no rule that we can posit that explains how speakers know which one to use. They just memorize that. However, for the regulars, this hypothesis just doesn't work. And we can demonstrate that it doesn't work by looking at novel words. Nouns are very prolific in English. We create new nouns regularly. And so all we've got to do is create a new noun. And this has been done with children. So this is often referred to as the WUG test. So you show a child a picture of this animal, this imaginary animal, and say, this is a WUG. Now there are two of them. There are two, and then the child has to fill in the blank. And, well, I think we all know what the child will say. The child will say, there are two WUGs, with that z sound. And if we give them a different imaginary animal and call it a gutch, then they're going to say that the plural for gutch is gutches. And if we've got another imaginary animal, say a gick, then the plural for that is going to be gicks. So children know this, and they can, have a brand new noun, and they know which form to use. So that hypothesis is out. So let's posit another hypothesis. Perhaps it has to do with spelling. Maybe we learn which plural to use based on the spelling of the words. Well, there's a really easy way to disprove this hypothesis, and that is to look at illiterate speakers. We've got a whole pool of illiterate speakers that is preschool children. And the truth is that before children ever enter school, before they ever enter kindergarten, for example, and start learning their ABCs, they know how to pluralize. That WUG test works perfectly fine for pre-literate children. You just have to say it aloud for them, and they will know to say WUG and WUGs and gutch and gutches and gick and gicks. So we can rule that hypothesis out too. So we will have hypothesis 3. Speakers know that the final sound of the noun determines the plural form, with some exceptions like child and children, or goose and geese. That's a better hypothesis, and it's actually a pretty good hypothesis. However, in a previous video, I talked about Occam's razor. Occam's razor tells us that we want fewer rules. The problem with this one is we would need a different rule for every possible ending of a noun. So we would have a different rule for ka and ga and ta and da and sa and sha and ra and ul. Every sound that can possibly end a noun, we would have to have a separate rule for that. So our rules are going to be the number of rules, I should say, is going to be huge. So a better hypothesis would be to say speakers know that some feature of the final sound of the noun determines the plural form. And if we do this, we won't need as many rules. So this is going to be our best hypothesis. And then the next step is coming up with our rules, figuring out which rules will account for the data. And our rules also should be understood as hypotheses. We will keep these rules as long as they account for the data we have, but we leave open the possibility that we may find new data that will cause us to reconsider, to revise our hypotheses. That's how science works. So the plural rules for English are going to go something like this. That first of all, we need a phonological rule that tells us that between two sibilants, and remember the sibilants are s and sh and z and j, as well as the two affricates of English, ch and j. It's these words that, or these sounds rather, that create a lot of white noise. And what we find is that in English, you just simply don't get two sibilants next to each other. That whenever two sibilants are close to each other in a word, it seems that we need to insert a schwa. So with that in place, we can posit two underlying representations for plural, one of two. One possibility is that it's underlyingly s and becomes a z in certain situations, or we posit that it's underlyingly z and becomes a s in certain situations. And as it turns out, either one of these underlying representations is going to give us the right data. So there's really no Occam's razor or anything here that we can use to determine which one is right. But presumably, speakers must in their heads have some underlying representation for the plural. So if it's s, then we assume that it becomes voiced when it immediately follows a voiced sound. And that's going to include when it immediately follows a schwa. So even if the preceding sibilant, like in fish, is voiceless, because we insert that schwa in there first, and the ordering is important, we need to do these rules in the right order. One first and two second. And then we voice it because it's following the schwa, and that in that case we get fish-us, not fish-us, or something like that. That wouldn't work. Okay, now, the other possibility is that our underlying representation is z. In this case, we're going to have the same phonological rule, we'll call that one, that inserts a schwa between two sibilants. But again, we need to make sure that we order that before our devoicing rule that would take that z and turn it to a voiceless sound immediately following a voiceless sound. All right, so in both cases, we have some sort of assimilation process going on where that plural morpheme becomes more similar to a neighboring sound. Now, we're going to assume this one here. We're going to assume that that's the right answer, partly because it seems that voiceless obstruents are more common cross-linguistically than voiced ones. And so they're, just from that point of view, and it's not strong evidence, but that seems to kind of tilt the balance towards assuming that it should be s underlyingly. Now we can see how our rules apply to actual words. So we begin with our underlying representations. For three nouns, we've got pig, we've got robot, and we've got kiss. All right, so we have those three nouns. We want to pluralize them, so we'll add an S to the end of each one. And then we look at our first rule, and we find that for pigs and robots, it's non-applicable because there's no sibilant immediately preceding that s. However, in the final one, we get a sibilant here and a sibilant here, or underlyingly it's up there, which means then that we need to insert that schwa. Now at that point, it's still kissas. That S is still voiceless. So then we go on to the next rule, and we see that with pigs, we're going to voice it because G is a voiced stop. It's a voiced velar stop. We see that T is voiceless, so that's non-applicable. And we see that schwa is voiced, and so then that S becomes a Z, ultimately giving us our phonetic forms that we see here: pigs, robots, and kisses. And so that's how it works. It's just sort of like a machine where you put in the input at the top. The input is always going to be our phonemic form, and we then get our output at the bottom. So it's just cranking it away, and that's how morphological and phonological rules work. Put it into the machine, crank it through, and see what our output is.